गुड मॉर्निंग फ्रेंड्स। तो आज हम स्टार्ट करने जा रहे हैं कुछ अच्छे क्वेश्चन हैं मेडिसिन के विच वी विल डिस्कस नाउ। सो कमिंग टू द फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन सेज दैट अ 60 year the first question says a 60-year-old hypertensive patient present to the emergency department with chest pain. The pain came on very suddenly in the left chest while he was lifting a heavy plant pot. The pain is difficult to localize. The intensity has been constant and remains persistent. En route to the hospital, it has changed location to the left side of the lower thoracic back. He has recently had treatment for thoracic back pain from a chiropractor. He is sweating and anxious but has no shortness of breath. Blood pressure is 160 by 90 mm of Hg. Heart rate is 100 BPM and saturation is 99% on room air. The ECG does not show acute ST changes. D-dimer is 1700 nanogram per ml. And troponin is still awaited. Based on the information available, what is the most likely diagnosis? Is it acute coronary syndrome? Is it acute coronary syndrome, pulmonary embolism, acute aortic syndrome, musculoskeletal pain, or pericarditis? Now, first we have to understand. Now, see, we can easily remove this option. We can easily neglect this option of musculoskeletal pain because in musculoskeletal pain, you will not have a positive D dimer. So, first thing, in musculoskeletal pain, you will not have a positive D dimer. Secondly, you have seen that this pain is changing its position. That is, it was initially in the left side of the chest, but afterward, initially it was on the left side of the chest, but after some time, it moved back to the lower thoracic back on the left side. That means this pain has changed its position, and this is a very characteristic of a specific pain that we will discuss in a few minutes later. So, this is not seen in case of musculoskeletal pain. So it is not a musculoskeletal pain because D dimer is positive. Secondly, this pain is changing its position. Now, coming to the acute aortic syndrome. The answer to this question is acute aortic syndrome. Why? The first reason is that this pain is constant and remains persistent. That means it is not a crescendo pain. Generally, ACS, acute coronary syndrome, what you see, the pain is crescendo. It changes its intensity and then it goes down. But this pain has been constant and remains persistent. It is a non-crescendo pain. This is the first reason why it is an acute aortic syndrome. Second, you have seen that this pain was initially on the left side of the chest and now it has gone to the left side of the back in the thorax region. So this pain, this actually is showing the direction of the blood or the movement of the blood, which we see in cases of the aortic dissection. So possibly this is the second reason why this pain can be acute aortic syndrome. Third, the patient has a high blood pressure, and fourth, it is the D dimer is positive. So these four things are pointing towards acute coronary syndrome. The first, that the patient pain is constant and remains persistent, that it is a non-crescendo pain. Second, this pain is changing position. First it was on the left side of the chest, then it moves to the left side of the back in the thorax region. Third, patient is hypertensive, and fourth, D dimer is heavily positive. Now we have to understand why this pain is not pericarditis, why this pain is not pulmonary embolism, why this pain is not ACS. So for this, now coming to the pericarditis, why this pain is not pericarditis. Now, if we discuss the case of pericarditis, see, in case of pericarditis, pain is generally present in the central region, that is precordial region, but it may be present in the left precordial area. So generally the pain is retrosternal, but yes, it may be present on the left precordial area. This pain can radiate just like an acute coronary syndrome to the neck, to the shoulder, and to the arm. So radiation can also be present in case of the acute pericarditis. Now the most important thing that we have to understand is a rule that is called as PTP rule. Here P refers to the pleuritic pain Any chest pain which increases on inspiration and coughing is called a pleuritic pain. I'm again repeating myself. Any pain which increases on inspiration and coughing is called a pleuritic pain. Please remember, if we compare acute coronary syndrome with pericarditis, acute coronary syndrome is not pleuritic, but pericarditis pain is pleuritic. Now coming to the tender. Tender means if we put pressure, pain will increases. So neither pericarditis pain is tender, neither pericarditis pain is tender, neither acute coronary syndrome pain is tender. Third point is positional. Positional means that in a specific position pain increases and in another specific position pain decreases. So we know that pericarditis is positional. That means it increases on lying down, but pain is relieved. A patient feel relieved when he is in the sitting position or he is in the standing position. Whereas acute coronary syndrome is it is not positional. So this is very helpful in differentiating, that is PTP, that is pleuritic, tender and positional. Also, there are certain pericarditis pain. According to Harrison, it has mentioned four type of pericarditis in which there is no pain. One is uremic pericarditis, which we see in CKD patient. Second is tubercular pericarditis. Third is radiation induced pericarditis, and fourth is neoplastic pericarditis. First is uremic pericarditis, which we see in CKD patient. Second is tubercular pericarditis. Third is radiation induced pericarditis, and fourth is neoplastic pericarditis. These are painless pericarditis. Also in pericardial, Harrison mentioned that at some level there is a pericardial rub is present at some point of the time. Now, also, so these are some of the clinical symptoms of the pericarditis. Now coming to the ECG finding of the pericarditis. Now for ECG finding of the pericarditis, you have to understand there are four basic keys that you have to understand. Four basic keys which you have to understand for pericarditis ECG. First, in pericarditis, in all the leads, I'm again emphasizing this point, in all the leads except AVR and lead V1, in all the leads generally you see ST segment elevation with concavity plus PR segment depression. So these are the two things. ST segment elevation means like this. This is the concavity, and you must have remembered that ST segment elevation with convexity, this is seen in case of the acute coronary syndrome or in cases of the MI. So in cases of, so first point is in all leads except AVR and V1, you see ST segment elevation with concavity and PR segment depression. Now this is the ST segment elevation with concavity which you see in pericarditis, and this is ST segment elevation with convexity which you see in acute coronary syndrome. Second, AVR lead. This is very important. You have to remember, if I'll say remember a single point, remember this second point. In AVR lead you will see ST segment depression plus PR segment elevation. See, this is just opposite of the first point. In first point you have ST segment elevation plus concavity and PR segment depression. Here you have ST segment depression with PR segment elevation. And the third point is known as spodic sign. Spodic sign. This spodic sign was asked in DM cardiology examination last year. What is a spodic sign? When you see lead 2, so what you find is that the TP segment, it is not straight, it is down sloping like this. This is called spodic sign, and presence of spodic sign is highly sensitive to the pericarditis. Fourth, you can see sinus tachycardia, that is generally because of the pain. So these are the four things that we'll now see in this particular ECG. Now the first point was we see in all leads except AVR and lead V1, we see ST segment elevation with concavity and PR segment depression. So see, if you see lead V1, see this is ST segment elevation with concavity, ST segment elevation with concavity, V5 ST segment elevation with concavity, V6 in also V2 and to some extent in V2 and V3 also. Now, if you see PR segment, you can appreciate the depression. See this slight depression. See this depression. You can also see ST segment elevation with concavity in lead 2, in lead AVF, in lead AVL. Okay, so this was the first point. Now second point, we have to see AVR. In AVR, we will see ST segment depression and PR segment elevation. So see this is the ST segment depression, and see PR segment elevation, PR segment elevation. This is very important. This was our second point. Now coming to the third point. Now see, this is T wave, this is P, this is T, this is P, this is T, this is P, this is T, this is P. Now see, this is down sloping TP segment. This is called as spodic sign. So it is highly suggestive of, so when these things are present collectively, you can very well say that this patient is suffering from the pericarditis. Now, very important thing, there is something which is called as benign early repolarization, BER, benign early repolarization. So how to differentiate benign early repolarization with acute pericarditis? So for that, we have a rule that is called as ST by T ratio. ST by T ratio. So what is ST by T ratio? We calculate it in lead V6, and value greater than 0.25 is acute pericarditis and value less than 0.25 is benign early repolarization. How you calculate it? In lead, first you go to the lead V6. Along the PR segment, draw a straight line. Measure the vertical distance of point J from this line. Here it is 2 small box, that is 2 millimeter. So this is the ST value. So ST value here is 2. Now from the same line, measure the highest point of the T wave. Here it is 1, 2, 3, 4. That is 4 small box, that is 4 millimeter. This is the T value. Now, so 2 by 4 here comes out to be 0.5, and which is more than 0.25, that means it is acute pericarditis. So a value of ST by T of more than 0.25 suggests acute pericarditis, and a value less than 0.25 is benign early repolarization. So it's very difficult to differentiate pericarditis on ECG with benign early repolarization, but by this ST by T you can know this. How to calculate? Draw a straight line from PR, calculate the vertical height of the J point, this is the ST value, then calculate the highest point of the T wave from this baseline, this will be the T value. Don't divide both of them. If the value is less than 0.25, it is benign early repolarization. If the value is more than 0.25, it is acute pericarditis. Now, coming to this question, now we have easily ruled out pericarditis. Why? Because here there is no preceding event, for example, kidney failure, tuberculosis, neoplasm or radiation. Second, the pain is neither pleuritic, neither pain is positional. Third, we are not getting any pleuritic, any pericardial rub. Plus ECG findings of pericarditis are not present. So by collectively, so in a nutshell, on a collective basis, we can say that this is not pericarditis. Now coming to the pulmonary embolism, why it is not pulmonary embolism? So see, in pulmonary embolism, if I ask you what is the most common symptom, what is the most common sign, the most common symptom which Harrison say is shortness of breath. Remember, in pulmonary embolism, there is no specific sign and symptom, and it is very difficult to diagnose in a patient. And in ICU, for example, where I work, a lot of the patient die of pulmonary embolism, and believe me, I can surely say that they they are undiagnosed. Okay, because a lot of time pulmonary embolism present like atrial fibrillation with shock, and it becomes very difficult to diagnose that. So most common symptom of pulmonary embolism is shortness of breath. Most common sign is tachypnea. Now you can easily see in our questions, neither the patient has shortness of breath, neither the patient has tachypnea. Now further, you can use this criteria to diagnose pulmonary embolism. If value is more than 4, then pulmonary embolism is highly specific. I generally use this criteria in ICU. And if the pulmonary embolism, if this score is less than 4, pulmonary embolism is less likely. So first, give score 3 to two things, A, B. A is symptom suggestive of DVT. So what are the symptoms of DVT? That may be pain, tenderness, and pain and swelling. Please remember, if there is also redness, you have to rule out cellulitis. Okay, if there is redness, you have to rule out cellulitis. And Harrison also mentioned a very close diagnosis, differential diagnosis of DVT is ruptured Baker's cyst. Ruptured Baker's cyst, and this you can diagnose easily on the basis of ultrasound. So you have, if you have pain, tenderness, swelling along with redness, you have to rule out cellulitis. Also in case of acute pain, please rule out ruptured Baker's cyst with the help of ultrasound. So 3 point is given to two things. First is symptom suggestive of DVT. Second, no other pathology is likely. That means you are clear cut, you are not able to say that the symptoms are due to some other pathology, and you can on the basis of clinical sign and symptom, you are able to say that this is because of the symptoms of patient is because of pulmonary embolism. So any other pathology is very unlikely. So these are points 3 to 2 things. Then 1.5 score is given to 3 things. You can remember this: see the ECG, see the patient history. So you can remember it by see the ECG, see the patient, and see the patient history. So see the ECG means if there is sinus tachycardia, that is heart rate is more than 100, give 1.5 score. If the patient has undergone surgery within 4 weeks, or patient is immobile for more than 3 days. Then third, history, if patient has history of DVT or pulmonary embolism. Okay, so in any of this is present, you give 1.5, and then 1 mark you give H and C if there is hemoptysis, if there is cancer history. Now add these points and you will see if it is more than 4, pulmonary embolism is likely, and if it is less than 4, pulmonary embolism is unlikely. Now here you see there is no symptom suggestive of DVT. This point, no other pathology. This B point is also not valid here. Yes, this point is valid, that is heart rate is around 100. But there has not been mentioned about surgery within 4 weeks or immobility of more than 3 days, so this point is also not valid. There is no history of DVT or pulmonary embolism, no hemoptysis, no cancer. So we get only 1.5 point. Also, we have seen that there is no symptom, that is shortness of breath, or there is no sign tachypnea. So pulmonary embolism is very unlikely in this case. So also we have ruled out pulmonary embolism. So we have ruled out musculoskeletal pain, we have ruled out pericarditis, we have ruled out pulmonary embolism, and we have said that why acute aortic syndrome is the diagnosis. 4 points we have already covered. Now why it is not acute coronary syndrome? See, in acute coronary syndrome there is radiation of pain, that is pain is felt in the left precordial area, retrosternal area, and it can radiate, but it does not change position. This changing of position from the left side to the back is highly suggestive of aortic dissection. So this is the first reason that this pain is most suggestive of acute aortic syndrome and less of the acute coronary syndrome. Okay, so that's why our answer is C, that is acute aortic syndrome, that is aortic dissection. Okay, coming to the next question. Now you have this patient, you are asked to review a 32-year-old smoker in emergency department. He has presented with an hour of ongoing chest pain. An hour, please remember, an hour of ongoing chest pain. The pain is described as left-sided and sharp but not focal. There is no postural change and no change with inspiration. That is, pain is neither pleuritic, neither positional. He appears clinically well. The emergency team are concerned because the has anterior ST elevation and show you his ECG. Now, if you see this ECG, you can easily see that there is the ECG ST segment elevation is with concavity. See this. Also, you can see the PR segment depression, PR segment depression, PR segment depression. See ST segment elevation with concavity, ST segment, PR segment depression, PR segment depression. In AVR, second point, that was ST segment depression, ST segment depression, PR segment elevation. Third, if you see there is TP segment sloping, that is Spodek sign. So you are very much assured that this is nothing but a case of acute pericarditis. Plus, please remember, you cannot initiate treatment just on the basis of ECG. You know that yes, this is acute pericarditis, but you can say that likely it is acute pericarditis. You cannot confirm the diagnosis of acute pericarditis because there are two things which we generally confuse with acute pericarditis. One is benign early repolarization, which I have just told, and second is acute coronary syndrome. Now, what is the question? The question is, what will you recommend? Activation of primary angioplasty team, await troponil, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory analgesia, urgent bedside echo, and CT pulmonary angiogram. So what will be your answer? The answer to this will be D for Delhi. Why? Because we have, through ECG, we have known that yes, it is likely that it is acute pericarditis, but we are so dreadful of this acute coronary syndrome that we will do a bedside echocardiography to rule out RWMA, that is regional wall motion abnormality. Okay, so if there will be no regional wall motion abnormality, then yes, this will be, then we can confirm yes that this is acute pericarditis. Okay, so if now, so the next best step will be urgent bedside echo to rule out regional wall motion abnormality. If regional wall motion abnormality comes negative, that means it is acute pericarditis, and after that we'll give a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, because there are a lot of cases practically. If you go, you will see that in spite that we know that yes, in acute coronary syndrome we have ST segment elevation with convexity, but there are a lot of chances in practical scenarios, conditions, that you also see ST segment elevation with concavity in cases of acute coronary syndrome. Therefore, you have to be doubly sure before labeling a patient of acute pericarditis, because you may lose the patient if a patient of acute coronary syndrome is labeled as acute pericarditis. Hope I am clear. Now, next question. In a patient with suspected rhabdomyolysis, which of the following is true and which of the following is true? The absence of myoglobinia exclude the diagnosis. Elimination of sodium bicarbonate and mannitol are the mainstay of the treatment. Alkalization of the urine aims to increase its solubility of the TAM horsefall protein and myoglobin complex. Bicarbonate should be titrated to a urinary pH of more than 9, and hypercalcemia is frequently seen in the early stage. So what is your answer? The answer to this question is C. Now we have to understand why the answer is C. Now, if this is your muscle, what happens in cases of rhabdomyolysis, there is destruction of the muscles. So when muscle is destroyed or necrosis of muscle occurs, content of the muscle comes out like potassium. So patient has hyperkalemia, lactate, patient has increased lactate, aldolase, creatine phosphokinase, and myoglobin. So these 5 things like creatine phosphokinase, myoglobin, lactate, aldolase, and potassium is high in the blood. And water comes inside this cell. So there is hypovolumic shock. Okay. So now what will be the mainstay of the treatment? Mainstay of the treatment is to give fluid resuscitation to the patient. The mainstay of the treatment is to give the fluid resuscitation to the patient. And there are a lot of guidelines. The one of them guideline is to give 500 ml of NS followed by 500 ml of D5. Okay, this 500 ml of NS in first hour, then in second hour 500 ml of D5. This you have to alternate. Then in the next third hour you will again give 500 ml of NS, and in the fourth hour you will again give 500 ml of D5. So you will alternate D5 and NS. Along with this you will give 50 millimole of bicarbonate every 1 to 2 hour, every 1 to 2 liter of fluid. So along with 1 to 2 liter of fluid you have to give 50 millimole of bicarbonate. So I'm again emphasizing that the basic treatment is that hypovolumic shock you have to resuscitate through RL and D5. Now why you give this bicarbonate? Because bicarbonate causes alkalinization. So this myoglobin of the patient forms linkage with the Tom Horsfall protein and they form crystal, and these crystals which are formed, they causes acute kidney injury. And if acute kidney injury occurs in this patient, prognosis becomes negative. So so that's why we also give bicarbonate. Please remember, it is not proven that this therapy helps, but in books it's written, even in Harrison it's written, but it hasn't been proved till date that this therapy helps. Therefore the basic treatment is, the mainstay of treatment is only fluid. Also for flushing we give mannitol. The dose of mannitol is 0.5 gram to 2 gram per kg TDS. Okay, it is, please remember, this is gram, 0.5 gram to 2 gram per kg TDS. Now there is very important thing. This, if the patient liver is functioning at a normal rate, then this myoglobin can goes to the liver and is actively metabolized. So we don't find myoglobin in the urine. So absence of myoglobin in the urine does not exclude the diagnosis of rhabdomyolysis. Please remember this, because in case of normal liver, this myoglobin is metabolized by that liver. So you have to understand. Now when you give bicarbonate, you have to maintain the urine pH of more than 7. Okay, so during our resuscitation, our goal is to maintain urine output of more than 200 ml per hour and maintain the urine pH of more than 7. These are our two goals. Urine output should be more than 200 ml per hour and urine pH should be more than 7. Now again, coming to that question, if we see absence of myoglobin exclude the diagnosis? No, because in a normal functioning liver it may be metabolized, and in cases of moderate to severe rhabdomyolysis you may not see myoglobin in the urine in spite of the presence of rhabdomyolysis. So this is wrong. Administration of sodium bicarbonate and mannitol are the mainstay of treatment? No, mainstay of treatment is resuscitation fluid, which is normal saline alternating with D5. Alkalization of the urine aims to increase the solubility of the TAM host protein and myoglobin complex. Yes, this is true. Bicarbonate should be titrated to urine pH of 9. No, it should be more than 7. Some books say 6.5, but most of the books say 7. Hypercalcemia is frequently seen. Please remember, the muscles also release phosphate which combine with the calcium. So initially we also see hypocalcemia in cases of the rhabdomyolysis. So it is not the hypercalcemia, but it is the hypocalcemia which is frequently seen in the early stages of the rhabdomyolysis. Now coming to the next question. Now this is a very good question on ABG. A 30-year-old female was administered to the ICU following a traumatic brain injury. Her ABG was normal on arrival. Since admission, her condition has deteriorated and she has now has developed circulatory failure requiring 100 microgram per minute of noradrenaline IV. And this is her ABG. Now, you have to tell me, you have to interpret this ABG. Now you have to tell me whether it is a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis plus high anion gap metabolic acidosis, or it is normal anion gap metabolic acidosis plus high anion gap metabolic acidosis plus respiratory acidosis, or C, there is NAGMA plus HAGMA plus also metabolic alkalosis hidden. Fourth, it is NAGMA plus respiratory acidosis. So you have to interpret and tell me this. This is the values of the, that it is NAGMA plus HAGMA, NAGMA plus HAGMA plus respiratory acidosis, or NAGMA plus HAGMA plus metabolic alkalosis, which is hidden, or NAGMA plus respiratory acidosis. So I will tell you how to solve these kinds of questions. Now first of all, you should understand, this is just for learning purpose. Now you see the pH is 7.10, that means it is acidosis. Now in acidosis, if PCO2 is more than 40, it is respiratory acidosis. If it is less than 40, it is respiratory acidosis. It is metabolic acidosis. So just remembering this point, if in acidosis PCO2 is more than 40, it is respiratory acidosis. If it is less than 40, it is metabolic acidosis. So here PCO2 is 35, that means it is metabolic acidosis. Now we are sure that it is metabolic acidosis. Now in metabolic acidosis, we know there is normal anion gap metabolic acidosis and there is HAGMA, that is high anion gap metabolic acidosis. So for that we have to calculate the anion gap. Anion gap is calculated by the formula sodium minus chloride plus bicarbonate. So here sodium is 146, chloride is 129 and bicarbonate is 11. So anion gap comes to be 6. Please remember, 12 plus minus 2 is taken as normal anion gap. Above it is taken as high anion gap metabolic. There are a lot of discrepancies. Different books will say different, but this you can remember. So the normal anion gap is 12 plus minus 2. So here the anion gap is 6, which is a normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. So this patient is having normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. This is for sure. Now we have to calculate the compensation, whether this metabolic acidosis is compensated or not. If you see compensation is calculated by the formula, that is PaCO2 should be 1.5 into bicarb plus 8 plus minus 2. This, so 1.5 into bicarbonate is 11 plus 8 and plus minus 2. This comes to be 11 5 is 55, 11 5, that is 16.5 plus 8, that is 24.5 plus minus 2, that is PaCO2 should be 22.5 to 26.5. PaCO2 should be this range, but PaCO2 is 35. That means we know that in metabolic acidosis the compensation is in the form of hyperventilation and the CO2 is removed and its value slowly decreases. So its value should be 22.5, between 22.5 to 26.5, but this value is 35. That means this patient is all on also retaining CO2. That means this patient has excess CO2. That means this patient is also having respiratory acidosis. Okay. If the PaCO2 value would have been in the range of this 22.5 to 26.5, that means this patient would not be having any residual respiratory acidosis. But since this patient has not able to hyperventilate or compensate by removing the CO2, he is having additional CO2 in the body. This residual CO2 is causing this respiratory acidosis. So now we are knowing that patient has normal and gap metabolic acidosis. Secondly, patient has respiratory acidosis. Now we have to know for knowing other disorders, we have to calculate, that is what is called as delta ratio. Delta ratio. What is delta ratio? So the delta ratio is calculated with the help of the formula. The formula for the delta ratio is anion gap minus 12 upon 24 minus bicarbonate. If this value comes between 0 to 0.4, it is called as NAGMA, that is normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. If 0.4 to 0.8, it is NAGMA plus HAGMA. If this value is between 0.8 to 2, it is called as HAGMA, only HAGMA. If this value comes more than 2, that means this patient has HAGMA plus metabolic alkalosis, because more than 2 means this bicarbonate is very large. That's why this whole thing is coming more than 2. So if more than 2, HAGMA plus metabolic alkalosis. Now we'll calculate here. Anion gap we have calculated came to 6 minus 12, 24 minus bicarbonate is 11. So this comes out to be 6 by 30. And this is coming out to be 6 by 13.0. So 13 4th year 12 52, that is 0.4. Okay, so it is coming in this range, 0.4. So that means this patient is having normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. If it would have come as 0.5, 0.6, okay, so then it will be called as NAGMA plus HAGMA. So this patient has NAGMA. We have already calculated through an anion gap that yes, this patient also had NAGMA. So now we are confirmed that this patient has a respiratory acidosis plus normal anion gap metabolic acidosis, that is NAGMA. So our answer will be respiratory acidosis plus normal anion gap metabolic acidosis. So we know how to calculate delta ratio. We have known how to calculate the compensation cases of metabolic acidosis. These things we have understood. Okay. Coming to the next question, interpret this ECG. Now you have to tell me if this is LBBB, complete LBBB or incomplete LBBB. It is RBBB or incomplete RBBB. You have to tell me this, complete, incomplete or RBBB. So we have to understand how to diagnose LBBB on the ECG. Now, if QRS duration is more than or equal to 120 milliseconds or 3 small box, then only you will think of bundle branch block. Now, so this is the first point, QRS duration should be more than 120 millisecond or 3 small box. Now we are here talking of LBBB, that is left bundle branch. Second, come to the left sided leads, that is lead 1, AVL, V5, V6. Here we will see R wave. There can be slurring of R wave. There can be notching of R wave. There can be broad R wave. Broad R wave means this, like this. Notching of R wave means like this, which is just like M pattern, and slurring of R wave like this. So these all three pattern are acceptable. This is slurring, this is notching, and this is broad R wave. So in these leads you have to see one AVL, V5 or V6, and please remember, if in any of these leads it is present, then it will be taken as positive. Third point, in lead V1 or V2 you will see a small R wave followed by a deep S wave, or absent R wave followed by a deep S wave. This is in lead 3. And the fourth point, absence of Q wave in lead V5 and V6. Please remember, normally due to septal depolarization in V5 and V6 we see normal Q waves. So if it has been asked that in which ECG lead you see Q waves normally, so you will say in lead V5 and V6 because of the septal depolarization. So this is absent in case of the left bundle branch block. So again I am repeating it. In QRS more than 120 millisecond or 3 small blocks. Second, in lead 1 AVL V5 or V6 you will see R wave which may be slurred or notched or broad R waves. And in V1 V2 you will see small R wave followed by a deep S wave, or absent R wave followed by deep S wave, and absence, and fourth point, absence of Q wave. Now we will see these things in this ECG. Now, what is complete LBBB and incomplete LBBB? If Q, please remember, if all these four things are present, it is called as complete LBBB. And if all these four are not present and one thing is absent, that is QRS duration is less than 3 small blocks, and rest of the thing is present, then it is called as incomplete LBBB. So first here we will see QRS duration. The QRS duration is more than 3 small blocks, first thing. The second point was in lead 1 AVL V5 V6 we will see slurred R wave, notched R wave, or broad R wave. So you see in lead 1 we have broad R wave, also we have a slurred R wave. This is V5 and V6, you see the broad R wave, also slurred R wave. Okay, so our second point is also fulfilled. Now third point was in lead V1 or V2 we will see a small R wave followed by deep S wave, or absent R wave followed by deep S wave. So we have a small R wave followed by a deep S wave, a small R wave followed by a deep S wave. And fourth point, we will see absent Q wave, so in V5 and V6. So see, there is no Q wave in V5 and V6. So we'll say that this patient has a complete LBBB. Okay, or whenever you have a complete LBBB, you have to see differential diagnosis, that is aortic stenosis, anterior wall MI, then hyperkalemia, congestive heart failure, or digitalis toxicity. These things you have to, these are the differential diagnosis in cases of the LBBB. Now coming to RBBB. Again this question, is it complete RBBB, incomplete RBBB? So again we'll follow that pattern. If QRS is more than 3 small box or more than 120 millisecond, this is the first point. Second point, in lead V1 or V2 we will see again R wave which may be slurred, or maybe slurred like this, or maybe M pattern like this, or it may be like this. All these pattern are acceptable, slurred, M pattern, or like this pattern. Then in lead 1 or V6 you see a deep S wave. What is deep S wave? So Braunwald say deep S wave means width of S wave is more than 40 milliseconds, that is one small box. So if these three things are present, that is QRS duration of more than 3 small box or 120 millisecond, V1, V2 you see slurred R wave, M pattern, or this kind of pattern. And in third, lead 1 or V6 we see deep S waves, that is width of S wave is more than 40 millisecond, then it is called as complete RBBB. If QRS is less than 3 small box and all these two things are present, then it will be called as incomplete RBBB. Okay, now we'll see this question, that whether this is complete RBBB or incomplete RBBB. So what you are seeing, you see in V1 we are seeing this pattern, that is M pattern. So yes, it is acceptable. So we see that QRS duration is more than 3 small box. Second, we are seeing in lead V1 we are seeing M pattern. Now lead 1 and AVL you are seeing deep S wave more than 1 small box. Deep S waves more than 1 small box. That means it is a complete RBBB. So this is a case of complete RBBB. Please remember, if in the same ECG, if this QRS duration would have been less than 3 small box or less than 120 millisecond, it will be called as incomplete RBBB. Now, whenever you see a complete RBBB, it is it is in most of the Indians or the world population, it's normally present. But if it is present with this symptom, you have to know following thing. First thing is, if it is acute, then it may be a suggestive of pulmonary embolism, that is acute pulmonary hypertension. Otherwise, it may be seen in cor pulmonale, that is chronic pulmonary hypertension. And third, post VSD surgery. Post VSD surgery, you also see RBB. I have seen a lot of patients after VSD surgery that they have developed right bundle branch block. So it's totally normal part. So this was my first lecture on the questions. I will again come with some more questions like this. Thank you.